Hello? Hello? I think we should start. It is 5 minutes past half. So my name is Professor Ortwin Knorr. I'm a professor of Greek and Latin here, mostly a Latinist, but we are classicists, so we do everything anyway. And I have the honor to welcome you here to our Rumpakis lecture for the year 2023. I have the honor to introduce my colleague, the actual Hellenist here in the room, Mary Bachvarova.
Thank you, Ortwin. So before I introduce our lecturer for tonight, just reminding you that we have 2 more lectures this year. In 2 weeks, we're going to have a lecture about the archaeological sites that have been exposed by the dry spell that has lowered the level of Lake Mead sufficiently for various Jimmy Hoffa bodies and pieces of cars to be found. But along with that are being exposed these earlier covered up Native American archaeological sites. And then our final lecture of the year is going to be on Magellan's voyage through the Pacific, tracing it archaeologically. So those are our last 2 for this year. And now I have the pleasure to introduce today's lecturer, who is coming to us from University of British Columbia. Megan Daniels did her BA at Wilfrid Laurier and her PhD at Stanford. She's been very involved in public scholarship, and she and her colleagues have won several major awards for that. She has published quite a few articles and also is working on a book on divine kingship in Greece, but has recently been published an edited volume called Homo Migrans, Modeling Mobility and Migration in Human History, and as well has a book in press along with Sandra Blakely called Data Science, Human Science, and Ancient Gods, Conversations in Theory and Method. So you can see that one of Megan's specialties is to combine the humanities with data science in interesting ways for new results. Let us welcome right now, Megan.
All right, thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone. If you can't hear me or I speak too fast, which sometimes happens, feel free to let me know. Please let me know if I'm standing the right length from this microphone. I'd like to thank John and Cleo Rumpakis for their generosity in funding this lecture series, and to the organizers of the Salem AIA and Classical Studies at Willamette University for inviting me here. And I'd like to thank all of you also for being here tonight. I'd like to acknowledge that I carried out my own research into this topic on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, where I currently live and work, and acknowledge that today we are on the territory of the Kalapuya peoples as well. So my talk is on I guess a popular topic, nude female figurines in ancient Greece. And so I always like to start off the talk just with showing this kind of imagery to people. And let you kind of look at it and take it in before I influence you, I should say, with all the scholarly interpretations of what this imagery is, as well as my own interpretations of this imagery. So what you're looking at is what's called nude female figurines, sometimes nude female goddesses. These ones are all in terracotta, and some you can hold in your hand, but some are somewhat larger, but they're all quite small scale, and they appear in the Greek world between about 800 and 550 BCE. And so my talk really revolves around this striking imagery that appear in this period. As I said, they're mainly in terracotta, but they occur in other types of media, like ivory and silver and bronze. But they're mainly these small-scale figurines. And the ones that you're looking at would be made in a mold as well, in that there would be the terracotta molded into the negative image, the clay would be poured in, and then when it hardened, it would be fired as these figurines. And so just take them in and think about what comes to your mind as you see this imagery. What do you think it represents? What is some other information you might want to know? In the Greek world, in this period, they were mainly found in sanctuaries dedicated to goddesses. They were dedications that people would have offered to the deity at a sanctuary. Some of them do come from graves as well. This imagery is usually called the nude standing female, and some of the kind of characteristics, as you can probably see, are frontal-facing female who is completely nude. Sometimes has some accoutrements like jewelry on. Sometimes some of them wear headdresses. You can see this one here, this really high one called a polos. The one in the middle also has a polos, but it's lower, very thick hair. And they make various types of gestures. One type, which you can see on the left, sorry, I'm making sure that my left is your left, can include hands kind of really stiff and straight by the sides. The other two have their hands kind of supporting their breasts. And this is a very interesting gesture that I'll think more about in this talk. Some of them also gesture towards their genitalia. And sometimes they adopt a kind of combination of these hand positions. For example, one hand kind of holding the breast, the other hand gesturing towards the genitalia. So of course this brings up a number of ideas about what this imagery might represent. Many of you hearing nude females are probably thinking more along these kind of lines coming into the talk tonight. These are large-scale, life-size or almost life-size marble sculptures of female nudes that were made in Greece in later periods. The one on the left, the Aphrodite of Cnidos, is 4th century, and the one on the right is 2nd century, the Aphrodite of Milos, also known as the Venus de Milo. These are Roman copies, but the originals came from those periods. So much later, when Greeks and others were sculpting more large scale and using things like marble. For these ones, these are occurring several centuries earlier, once again between about 800 and 550 BCE, and as I said, made primarily as mold-made terracotta figurines. And they show up all over the Greek world. You can see this graph, kind of map graph that I made from this original catalog that dates back to 1990, so it's almost 30 years old, many more excavations. Certainly this map needs to be updated. But you can see this map's kind of looking northeast, if I have my cardinal directions right. So this is mainland Greece. This is Western Turkey, which was known as Asia Minor or Ionia in the ancient world. And then, of course, the Greek islands, which includes Crete. And quite a large number of specimens come from Crete. And as I said, most of these indeed come from sanctuaries dedicated to goddesses. So, in this appearance of this imagery in the Greek world, I'll talk about this, kind of come back to this point at the end, but it emerged at a time of real social, political, and economic change between 800 and 550. I'll look at some of the chronology and what's happening in the Greek world at that time and how this imagery relates to that social changes. And I'll kind of do that at the end when I come back to some of my newer interpretations of what this imagery means. But I also want to stress that while it shows up in the Greek world between about 800 and 550, it has a really long history across the Middle East and Egypt as well that goes back to the 3rd millennium BCE. And so in this talk, I'll also kind of detail some of that much longer history because it impacts how we've come to interpret this imagery in the Greek world as well. And a lot of that has to do with our assumptions about Greece's relationship to peoples in the Middle East and Egypt. So overall, I just think, this is just as my introduction, I think this sculpture is fascinating. As a researcher studying ancient Greece, I'm broadly interested in studying and understanding the ancient Mediterranean as a whole, as a very multi-ethnic and highly mobile place, where it's simply impossible to draw strict boundaries around any one culture or region, despite the tendency to label things as Greek or Roman or Egyptian or Cypriot. And I think that this world for millennia saw a really rich amount of interaction and influence between Southern Europe, Western Asia, and Northern Africa. And for me, religious practices and iconographies are a great way to study these multi-ethnic and multi-directional influences. And I think the nude standing female is especially representative of such phenomena. But I think another thing that I want to bring out in this talk is I think this imagery is also fascinating for the insights we gain about our own modern attitudes and assumptions. And this concerns two things. One, I've already mentioned, it's how we position the Greeks in relationship to their neighbors in the Middle East and Egypt. And two, how we interpret the complex meanings of nudity, particularly female nudity, within cultures that in many ways are far removed from our own. And so this is kind of how I'll proceed for the rest of this talk. I want to introduce the kind of deeper history of this imagery. which will help us understand its meaning in the Greek world. And think in the second point about these are assumptions about Greece's relationship with the Middle East and Egypt. These are often called Orientalist and Orientalizing interpretations. That's a bit of jargon, but I'll explain what I mean by those. And then I'd like to, turn back to these figurines and think, well, what did they really mean to the people dedicating them in sanctuaries? And with kind of reconsideration of this imagery and what it meant in the Greek world. So that was my introduction to the nude female and its appearance in Greece. Here's my very crude map that shows kind of other locations where it emerged. So here's Greece again. I hope you can see my mouse. Yep. And this is, of course, Turkey, and then into deeper into the Middle East, places like Mesopotamia, the Levant, Cyprus, and Egypt down here. It had a really long period of development in the Middle East and Egypt. Its earliest appearance is in places around Mesopotamia, in the period we generally call the early Bronze Age. This is a drawing of a jar handle from the city-state of Kish in Mesopotamia. It dates all the way back to 2500 BCE. And there's certainly other examples from Mesopotamia of these early appearances of the nude standing female. Its period it really proliferates slightly later in a period called the Late Bronze Age, about 1500 to 1100 BCE, across different areas in the Middle East, Cyprus, and into Egypt. And you can see, I hope you can see, these aren't the best images or the largest, but they show some of the similar gestures that you've already seen, right? Often with hands under their breasts. You can see some more elaborate examples here and down here of the nude female who's actually has her arms outstretched and is holding things in her hands. Sometimes this one, it's really small. She's holding goats, some kind of caprid type animal. And this one is holding snakes and lotus flowers in her hands. So there's kind of these more elaborate versions too. This one's also standing on top of a lion. Very hard to see. This is a drawing of a small gold pendant. These are figurines again. Here's a figurine from Cyprus. And this is a fragment of a larger stone stele. So they emerge in a number of different media. A number of different contexts too. They're not all coming from sanctuaries in the Middle East. Many of them come from domestic household contexts too. So the contexts are different as well. What's really fascinating, this period, the Late Bronze Age, it's a really fascinating period to study for the vast amount of interconnections between peoples in this world. Between Egypt, which is known as New Kingdom Egypt to us at that time, the Hittite Empire, which was powerful in much of Turkey and into Syria, and other city-states and territorial states around the Middle East, especially up and down the coast of the Levant and Cyprus, and to some extent Greece as well. We have records from this period that just show the amount of interconnections and trade and diplomacy taking place between these regions. So it's kind of interesting to see them also kind of adopt a very kind of similar way of portraying the nude female into all of their cultures and all of their own traditions. We certainly know they traded gods. In Egypt, they're worshiping gods from the Levant and vice versa. So certainly that's going on. Certainly the Hittites adopted a number of gods from Mesopotamia. And it is really fascinating. It's actually striking in Egypt especially too, because from what you know of Egyptian art, most of their humans and gods are often shown in profile, and it's very interesting to see them kind of also adopt this frontal-facing nude female figurine. Some of these are quite elaborate examples. For most of the Near East, in the Late Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, which is the next period, they show up like Greece, like in the Greek world, as these kind of small-scale terracotta mold-made figurines and plaques. And the excavators excavating in this region, I don't know if I'm standing in front of that, but they started to refer to them as Astarte figurines or Astarte plaques, because the ones that are kind of just in relief are referred to as plaques. Who is Astarte and why are they called that? Astarte is one of the major goddesses worshipped especially in this region, in the Levant, who's thought to be kind of the Western outgrowth of this other very powerful goddess known as Ishtar in Mesopotamia. And scholars tended to draw associations between this nude imagery and these great goddesses, these great and powerful goddesses like Ishtar and Astarte, who seemed to be associated with sexuality, with warfare, who were quite dangerous, and dangerous, powerful goddesses associated with like a number of very powerful traits like sexuality and warfare. And so this name is stuck. So if you start to look at literature about these figurines, they'll often still be called Astarte figurines or Astarte plaques. The question, of course, is, are they these goddesses? Who are they actually representing? And this is something I will also come back to at the end. Are they actually a goddess? And remember, in the Levant, many of them are found in households. There's the Levant, sorry. So turning to the Greek world, so this is so I was spending some time in the late Bronze Age and the development of this imagery over the late Bronze Age in this region. We do find some examples in the late Bronze Age in the Greek world, and I'm happy to talk more about those. I'm not going to go into that. There's not that many, but they really proliferate in this period that I've called the Iron Age and slapped on some very rough dates. We don't have great dates for the Iron Age. But this is, what you really are seeing certainly is this early development in Mesopotamia, a greater popularity in the Middle East, the Levant, Egypt, and Turkey and Syria, and then showing up much later in the Greek world. In this period, we generally call the Iron Age. There's a big separation between the late Bronze Age and Iron Age. Some of you may know this. Around 12 to 1100 BCE, there is general widespread collapse. I don't have time to go into all this, but many city-states are burned and abandoned around Greece and other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. There's evidence of climate problems, of mass migrations of people, of depopulation of areas. And in the Greek world, this was particularly significant, so much so that, here's my very crude timeline of ancient Greece. This period following the Bronze Age was referred to as a Dark Age, where very little seemed to be discoverable archaeologically in the way of settlements, in the way of art. Certainly there was no writing. Dark Age I have in quotes now because people preferred a more neutral term like the early Iron Age. And then moving into these later periods in the pink, the geometric and archaic period, these are art historical names for these periods. These are seen as a time when Greece and other parts of the Mediterranean and Middle East started to kind of pick up again. We see population growth, we see the development of monumental art and architecture, the growth of cities, the movement of peoples, trade and exchange. And it's really kind of, I said that the nude female kind of emerges kind of about 800 to 550 BCE, so kind of straddling these two periods, the geometric and the archaic period. And it was kind of in the cusp of these two periods. And it over the course of the 20th century, scholars working on the materials of Greece, more excavations, more things being studied, noticed that there was a lot of artistic interchange in the types of art that were being produced with places in the Middle East, with Egypt. There seemed to be a great amount of influence from Egypt and the Middle East on Greek art. This is also argued for the literature, for example, Homer's epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, the writings of other ancient authors were seen to kind of take inspiration and influence from the Middle East and from Egypt. And such that scholars actually termed this the Orientalizing period. This is where we get into some jargon. You can see this example, for example, the Greek terracotta mixing bowl with sphinxes was seen to draw inspiration from types of motifs being produced in Mesopotamia, in the Levant, and Egypt. And so certainly the nude standing female was kind of seen as part of this phenomenon, right, where Greek-speaking peoples were looking to the Middle East and Egypt for artistic inspiration and adopting these types of motifs into their own artistic repertoire. And so it really kind of sits around this period right here, about roughly 800 to 600 BCE. And you can see the word Orient in it, right, which is obviously referring to this tendency to see a kind of movement from east to west of luxuries, of artistic and literary motifs that the Greeks are kind of using to influence their own art. And so I just want to rest here for a bit and consider, because these assumptions that are built into our understanding of Greece and its relationship to its neighbors have really colored how the nude female was interpreted. Scholars, working really in the 80s and 90s, really started to elaborate on this period and to define it archaeologically. One famous scholar, Walter Burkett, wrote this book it was in German in the 1980s, but translated into English in 1992, called The Orientalizing Revolution, Near Eastern Influence on Greek Culture in the Early Archaic Age. And he defined the Orientalizing period with these words. He called it that decisive epoch in which, under the influence of the Semitic East, Greek culture began its unique flowering, soon to assume cultural hegemony in the Mediterranean. So this is a term, a phrase that I like to think about with my students. What is Burkert actually really saying about this relationship? What assumptions is he kind of building into this statement about what the Orientalizing period is? It seems to be that he's saying that this is something that a period when Greeks were influenced by peoples to the east of them, and that they kind of took those influences and made them into something better. And I think while the concept of an Orientalizing period was meant to stress influences and connections between Greece and the Middle East, it also, I think, tended to highlight the assumed differences and the schisms between this culture by suggesting that one monolithic culture could then be influenced by another monolithic culture called the East. And that first culture goes on to develop something much superior. And I should say that many scholars, including Burkert, have nuanced these ideas. And I'd say even Burkert, this very book, was probably a little more nuanced in this interpretation than this quote that I pulled from it seemed to suggest. But I think this assumption of an east-west divide between Greece, ancient Greece, and the ancient Middle East and Egypt still remains to this day. And I think it's built into the ways that we portray Greece, the way that we teach, the way that Greece is and its neighbors are portrayed in popular culture and popular media. These are often summed up in phrases and ideas like the Greek miracle, where Greece is, all the kind of things that define an amorphous, thing called the West are seen to develop in Greece. So these could mean anything: architecture, philosophy, astronomy, science, and that Greece is kind of this uniquely positioned as this kind of origin story for this thing we call Western civilization. And a lot of it had to do with kind of drawing Greece into a Western European identity and kind of separating it from the peoples around them. And these assumptions might just seem innocent. They might be simply a way of ordering history and organizing the way we study history. But obviously, I think hopefully we can all agree that these aren't always that innocent, because there's a lot of ideas about cultural superiority built into terms like the West and Western civilization. And I think these assumptions continue to be used for quite nefarious purposes nowadays. One of the major scholars, I won't go, like I said, too much into jargon here, but Edward Said, he a post-colonial scholar, wrote a book called Orientalism in 1978, really highlighting the problems of this tendency to divide the West from everything that was considered non-West. In this case, he was largely looking more into attitudes of the 18th and 19th century colonial powers in Western Europe towards regions that they subjugated or were attempting to subjugate, and was trying to examine how these attitudes and assumptions about a superior and progressive West and an inferior exotic East had undergirded so many of their foreign policies, relationships, and frankly the atrocities that were committed under colonial regimes. So he wasn't really looking at how we look at the ancient world, but I think I've always learned a lot from this work about how we've also tended to kind of separate Greece from the East. And Said, he cared a lot about language and just the very terms that we use. And I'll just quote one thing that really made me think more carefully about how we're studying the ancient world. He said, when one uses categories like Oriental and Western as both the starting and end points of analysis, research, public policy, the result is usually to polarize the distinction. The Oriental becomes more Oriental, the Westerner more Western, and we thus limit the human encounter between different cultures, traditions, and societies. And I think that really kind of hits the nail on the head as to what some of the problems with is just assuming a kind of orientalizing phenomenon in Greece where there's this brief period of artistic influence that the Greeks then take and develop into something better. And I think it's filtered into how we've interpreted the nude standing female. So I should probably turn back to that and think about what other scholars have said about it. One scholar that has really influenced my work, and I do love this book, it was written in 2000 by Nano Marinatos, The Goddess and the Warrior. you might notice that she has the same image that Walter Burkert has on his too, showing the nude female, showing in fact 4 nude females. You might wonder what they're standing on. They're standing on panther heads, and one of them is holding the panthers in her hands, and there's 3 more above, making the hands under the breast symbol. It's hard to see. This is a great bronze horse frontlet that a horse would have worn over its face. Usually to protect it riding into battle, but in this case it was probably quite ceremonial. And totally opulent. And in fact, it has an inscription, you can barely see it, that states that it was the property of a king of Damascus, but ended up in a Greek sanctuary. So how it ended up in a Greek sanctuary, we don't know. You can tell tales of roving mercenaries who stole these things and traded them. So she has the same one, and it's obviously a great kind of example of this orientalizing phenomenon that shows up. But so she has a number of great interpretations about what the nude female is, but she also writes things like this in the book that really give you pause. She says, naked goddesses appear in Greece in the 8th century, flourished during the 7th, the orientalizing period par excellence, and vanished by the 6th. They represent the short-lived but important courtship of Greece with the Near East, which has been stressed recently by many scholars. So I underlined that part because it really even is really amazing as her interpretations in her book are that she offered about the nude female. She still kind of tends to attribute it to this kind of brief flirtation between Greece and the East. Another scholar, also hugely influential in my work, Stephanie Boudin, says, it appears likely that these images, nude females, were seen as oriental exotica, used by Greeks to flaunt their far-reaching connections outside the Greek world. And once again, some of this might be true. Elites, upper class, like to flaunt their power and wealth by getting exotic stuff, and I'm sure we could think of examples nowadays. But also, once again, once summing this up as oriental exotica, just these things that were kind of used superficially, was also something that gave me pause. And maybe you just really want to think more deeply about what this imagery was. It shows up in so many parts of the Greek world, mainly in sanctuaries to goddesses, that I thought there must be deeper trends here. And so I think this imagery was representative of much deeper interconnections between peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. And I think it symbolize shared ideologies and worldviews and specific attitudes towards human beings' relationships with their gods. And I think I'll go into some of this now and think about what did especially some of the symbolism of this figurine, this image mean, is particularly the nudity and particular gestures. Once again, just like orientalizing and Orientalism, there are attitudes and assumptions towards nudity, in particular female nudity, that have colored our modern interpretations of this imagery, and I think obscured the deeper meanings. It's especially apparent in how the nude female in the Middle East was interpreted by modern scholars. And Isaac Cornelius, who wrote a book about the nude female in Syria, Palestine, stated nicely and bluntly that representations of naked women seem to have somewhat bothered earlier scholars working in the ancient Near East. He has a nice way of just putting things very plainly. And so he's got some examples that I won't list them all, but he says, writing of a nude figurine in the late 19th century, one scholar noted, she now rejoices in her comparatively entire anatomy, although, I regret to say, not clothed. So lots of disapproving Victorian types of attitudes. William Albright, he's the one who called the figurines Astarte figurines. He seemed to hate the Canaanites. He kind of portrayed them as savage and lewd, and articulated that through their preference for nude females. He wrote that Canaanite goddesses always appear naked in Egyptian portrayals of this age, in striking contrast to the modestly garbed native Egyptian goddesses. So definitely, there's deeper judgments about other things built in there, but certainly also the idea of female nudity as being something that's carnal, lewd, savage, dangerous, problematic, taboo, certainly stymied a lot of deeper interpretations of this imagery. And I just like this quote by Julia Sante. She says, since the end of the 19th century, scholars have fashioned a monument of exotic Eastern profligacy out of the Mesopotamian female body. So these were often, one of the interpretations of many of these figurines was that they represented courtesans. Sometimes when they appeared in graves, one popular, and this actually, if you go to the art gallery, this is mentioned in one of the art gallery pieces too, they were thought to be concubines for the dead in the afterlife. So often the ideas of sexuality and eroticism were attached to them. Another kind of branch of interpretation was just more a general fertility goddess. Kind of, the nudity symbolized the fertility, or was this kind of a holdover of some kind of universal mother goddess that was symbolized through these figurines? So I started just questioning what this nudity might have meant. And what particular gesture and particular parts of the body might have symbolized. Because if you remember, this nude standing female is often making particular gestures to parts of the body. And I'll just talk about the breasts. I won't talk about, we can talk about other examples in question period. Breasts, as I just started researching, well, what do these symbolize in literature, across the Middle East, across Egypt, across Greece, and the wider Mediterranean world? Certainly they can be sexual objects. They can symbolize fertility and abundance as well. I'll give you an example of that. There's a bunch of hymns from Mesopotamia to the great goddess Ishtar, right? And she was one of the goddesses who was thought to maybe have been behind this imagery. Ishtar and her lover Dumuzi, they have lots of fun, I think they were quite humorous songs about their dalliances with one another, and they sing to one another, and there's definitely lots of vulgar language. And at one point, one hymn, Dumuzi says to her, "O mistress, let your breasts be your fields." Inanna, which is another name for Ishtar, let your breasts be your fields, your wide fields which pour forth flax, your wide fields which pour forth grain. Make water flow from them. So certainly, yeah, there's ideas of sexuality and fertility. That's not to throw out all of these interpretations. But more often than not, the breasts were often associated with breastfeeding and nursing and nourishing. And you see these interesting examples in different epics where gods, heroes, like kind of legendary heroes or mortal heroes, claim to draw power, to draw legitimacy from claiming to have nursed at the breast of a goddess. Here's an example from the city-state of Ugarit, where they found a number of textual sources of texts, many of which preserved epic tales. And there's one tale known as the Epic of Kirta, who's a king. And in this epic, he is wondering about his son, and his son is prophesied to become a great ruler, a great hero. And his son, it says, this is of Ugarit in Syria, tells of a king named Kirta, whose son was prophesied to drink the milk of Athirat. He will drain the breast of the virgin. So what does that mean? I mean, these are two goddesses. We can talk about who these are once again after. I don't want to spend too much time going into the specifics, but the point is that his greatness is proclaimed by saying he will drink from the breasts of goddesses. This symbolizes both a kind of intimacy between certain humans, i.e. kings and heroes, with the gods, and also a sense of being kin with them, right? Being close to them, almost being gods themselves without saying that they're gods, right? It's kind of a way around saying, I am a god. This is a tricky thing in the ancient world. And as Mary mentioned, I am writing a book on divine kingship, so I've been thinking about these issues as well. Here's an image from Ugarit from the same period it's a drawing of an ivory furniture panel. I hope you can make it out. It's showing these two, they're not babies, they're youths, drinking from the breasts of a great winged goddess with these two horns and a sun disk between them. We don't know who this is. There's interpretations of which goddess this might be. But this is, once again, you see lots of imagery like this of not babies, but kind of youths or even grown men drinking from the breasts of these goddesses. In Egypt, same thing. Let's look over on the right side first. This is from the early Bronze Age. Once again, the pharaoh Sahure, who's not a baby, not quite a man, as a youth who is drinking from the breast of a goddess, and she's holding her breast out to him. It's the goddess Nekhbet. On the other side is a late Bronze Age relief from the temple of Hatshepsut, showing the pharaoh Hatshepsut drinking from the udder of a cow, who is indeed the great goddess Hathor. She's often portrayed in bovine form. You might notice the horns, the cow horns with a sun disk, again, just like we saw on this goddess, right? There's clearly influence between these regions. An example from Mesopotamia, from the Iron Age, has a king kind of claim that he didn't have a father and mother, that he grew up in the lap of his goddesses. He's King Ashurbanipal of Assyria. And he says, I knew no mother or father. I grew up in the lap of my goddess. As a child, the great gods guided me, going with me on the left, right, and left. The lady of Nineveh, who's Ishtar, the mother who bore me, endowed me with unparalleled kingship. The lady of Arbela, also Ishtar, my creator, ordered everlasting life for me. And in another text from the same period of the same king, it has him kind of in dialogue with this other god named Nabu. And Nabu says to him at one point, you were a baby, Ashurbanipal, when you sat in the lap of the queen of Nineveh, Ishtar. Her 4 tits are placed in your mouth. 2 you suck, and 2 you milk to your face. Strange text. Everyone kind of laughs uneasily when they read that. I think it might be hearkening back to this bovine imagery. That there's some, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly. This is an Egyptian goddess Hathor, not Ishtar, but it's clearly still drawing from those same ideas. So the study of the meaning of the breast in ancient literature brought me to this idea of the nursing female. This is what scholars call her, the nursing goddess, whose breasts are not lewd or sexual, but represent intimacy, kinship, and protection, and moreover are sources of power, authority, and legitimacy for those who get to nurse from them. But this research has taken us into the realm of, if you've noticed, of clothed females and not nude ones. And some scholars have drawn a sharp line saying the nursing female is motherly and clothed and modest, and the naked female is still these kind of dangerous, erotic goddesses that are not motherly. Sexual and carnal and dangerous. We do have examples of this imagery cross-fertilizing as well. You can see this is a nude female from Cyprus holding a child. Several examples from Cyprus. This one's from Israel. You can see lots of armbands and necklaces, but also holding a child as well. And so, by and large, most of them are without children, but there's certainly cross-fertilization between these two areas. And so, turning back to the Greek world now, I just want to think about, well, what could this have meant then if these kind of figurines were dedicated mainly in sanctuaries to specific goddesses? How did the Greeks feel about this? I mean, most of the examples I've given you were from Egypt and the Middle East. And certainly there's interesting examples. So I started combing through some of the Greek literature as well. The first instance that actually kind of turned me onto this topic, and this is just one of these great things about talking to people and sharing ideas, and one of my peers in my grad program, when I was puzzling over these figurines, said, well, there's a scene in the Iliad where Hector is going to go fight Achilles. And it's alluded and foreshadowed in the Iliad that this is Hector's death, right? He's not going to survive this. And his parents, Queen Hecuba and King Priam, beg him not to go. And this is a nice scene of this. And at one point, Hecuba, his mother, to try to move him, the Iliad has these lines, and for her part, his mother in her turn wailed and shed tears, loosening the folds of her robe, while with the other hand she held out her breast, and shedding tears, she spoke to him winged words, Hector, my child, respect this and pity me, if ever I gave you the breast to lull your pain. So not a happy scene, of course, but also the breast being used to once again emphasize uses of kinship and intimacy to show this kind of relationship of her to her son Hector. We have examples in the Greek world of heroes who nurse at the breast of goddesses and become heroes, and then sometimes even become immortal. Actually, this isn't from the Greek world. This is from Italy. It's a drawing of an engraved bronze mirror showing Hercules, fully adult, clearly nursing from the breast of Hera. And that is one of the versions of explaining how Hercules, who was immortal but the son of Zeus, how he gained immortality to sit amongst the gods, was that he nursed from Hera's breasts. In one version, she's tricked into nursing him, and she rips him away, and her breast milk spills out everywhere, and it becomes the Milky Way, right? It's like the origins of the Milky Way. But lots of different versions floating around. And in the Greek world, so, I'm nearing the end here, but many of these images in the Greek world, as I said, are found in sanctuaries, and many of the other images from the sanctuaries show images of heroes battling monsters, right? This is Hercules with the Hydra. These are ivory plaques from a sanctuary at Sparta. This is Perseus slaying Medusa. This is another warrior. On the island of Crete, down here, many of the temples, some of them have monumental versions of the nude female. And what this one shows, it's hard to see, it's very fragmentary. He's a man in between, kind of running but grasping both of these females. And it's thought to be kind of possibly a male, a warrior, deriving once again power from kind of grasping them. And that's Nanomarinatos' interpretation. Another sanctuary has monumental nude females as well, and has these kind of friezes of warriors parading around the temple too. So there seems to be this association of elites, of warriors, with the nude female as well. So is it kind of this idea that this dedicating this kind of represents this close relationship that one has with the goddess that they are worshiping, maybe alluding to the fact that they themselves are heroes, not kings. We don't really have, we can't call them all kings, or even any of them, elite males in the Greek world of this period, kings. But are they kind of aspiring towards these same types of statuses as heroes like Hercules got to aspire to? I'll end with just a few. So one kind of lasting question about this, though, is that when you dedicate these nude females, like, are these the goddess? Remember, some of them had interpreted them as Ishtar or Astarte. And I'll just quickly show three lasting images that have made me think about this question. And they come from vastly different parts of the world, of the Middle East and Mediterranean. This is a cylinder seal with a carving on it, and this is the carving rolled out onto clay. This is a stele, that's from Syria. This is a stone upright stele from Egypt, showing, it's hard to see, but it's worshippers worshiping a goddess, and the nude standing female on top, with two gods on either side of her, standing on a lion, holding lotuses and snakes. And the one down here is from Olympia in Greece, and it's a drawing of a bronze bowl. And I'll show you these in turn. This cylinder seal image clearly seems to show a goddess and a human conversing with one another. It's hard to see. The goddess they're often marked out as gods because of this kind of horned helmet that they wear. But between them is the nude female making this gesture. This is often how she shows up in cylinder seal imagery. She seems smaller than them. She almost seems like a figurine herself in this image. And it's almost as if she is some kind of conduit for the human to converse with the goddess. Not the goddess herself, but a kind of a spirit or an inroad, something that allows the human to be close to the goddess. So that was one piece that gave me pause. The stele from Egypt's really interesting. It's full. Egyptian artifacts are great often because they put text all over it, so you don't have to guess at who the god or goddess is. But it's a family of people, of worshippers, worshiping a goddess down here. She's seated, and her name is Anat, and she comes from the Levant as well. So it clearly says they're worshiping Anat. Above here is the nude female, and she is named in the inscription above as Kadeshet, which is thought to be related to a Levantine, a Semitic word that means holiness. Lots of ink spilled about who Kadeshet is. I won't get into that, but it's interesting that there's this kind of concept of holiness attached to this imagery, and that they're not actually worshiping Kadeshet. They're worshiping a goddess that we know actually existed called Anat. So is she kind of, once again, some divine force that appears in the context of the actual worship of goddesses for worshipers, right? I'm not sure. These are just kind of questions I'm throwing out. And finally, the image here, this bronze bowl, which is hard to make out without the drawing, which is done by Glynis Fawkes. But you can see all things going on. Musicians, you can see people worshiping kind of symbols here, and people sit seated. Warriors battling monsters below. A nursing female seated on a chair. Once again, the worship of kind of moons, like celestial symbols here, a celestial symbol in the middle, and of course the nude standing female kind of framing this activity going on. So once again, the nude standing female is not, I assume this is a goddess. Maybe some of these seated figures are goddesses. These are clearly worshipers who are playing music in festivals. So the nude female is not the goddess being worshipped, but seems to be part of this whole kind of cycle of worshiping goddesses, of being a hero, right? Of doing all these kind of things that proper elite males in this world are supposed to do. So I think my thinking keeps evolving on this, but I think they are kind of an inroad to this kind of connection and intimacy with the gods, rather than necessarily being a deity themselves. My work is kind of as I said, evolving on this always. This is kind of the updated counts that I've made of where these appear in the Greek world. And you can see that it spikes in the 800 and 700 and really drops off, right, in the 4th and 5th centuries. And a lasting question, which I can't answer now, is why? Why do they give up this imagery? And I think a lot of it has to do, and this is what I will try to argue in my work and investigate further, is actually changing attitudes towards these types of relationships with gods in the Greek world, with the rise of the city-state, with new ideas about governance. We do see the rise of so-called democracies and more moves towards egalitarianism that maybe, claiming that you were you were a special person who was the son of a goddess. Maybe those trends kind of fell out of favor in some of these new environments. This is something that I need to obviously flesh out a little more. But of course, that question remains: is why do they disappear by and large? So I hope I give you a kind of good, investigation of some of the major issues surrounding this. I think this imagery is just so fascinating, and I think it really allows us to reevaluate our assumptions about East and West, about nudity, and about just thinking about the deeper meanings of what they meant to the people who actually used them, including especially from in terms of my interest in the Greek world. So I will end there. I'll thank you all for letting me blab on for 40 minutes or so, and thank you.
We are ready for questions. Megan, are you ready to be tested?
Yeah. Yes, yeah.
Thanks a lot for a very interesting lecture tonight, Professor Daniels. And you have solved a mystery for me, having to do with a text that is somewhat later than all of these figurines. This is a text from the 1st century of the Common Era, Syrian, and perhaps you know it, the Odes of Solomon. And in the Odes of Solomon, there are several passages having to do with God and breasts and milk.
Yeah.
Can I give you an example?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, this is Ode 19. This is to go with all your outrageous orientalizing theories. Equally titillating. A cup of milk was offered to me, and I drank it in the sweetness of the Lord's kindness. The Son is the cup, and the Father is he who was milked, and the Holy Spirit is she who milked him. Because his breasts were full, and it was undesirable that his milk should be ineffectually released, the Holy Spirit opened her bosom and mixed the milk of the 2 breasts of the Father. She gave the mixture to the generation without their knowing, and those who have received it are in the perfection of the right hand.
Oh, it's so interesting. Yeah.
Now there are 5 or 6 odes in the collection of about 50 odes. These are early Christian hymns, and there are 5 or 6 of them that employ this imagery, where the Father has the Father has breasts, and people nurse from them. Just one more example, just to give you an idea of how, Okay, this is from Ode 8. You might find this interesting. This is the beginning of the ode. Later on, they'll talk about these people nursing from the breasts of God. Open your hearts to the exaltation of the Lord, and let your love abound from the heart to the lips, in order to bring forth fruits of the Lord, a holy life, and talks the watchfulness of his light. Okay, now, rise up and stand erect, you who sometimes were brought low. You who were in silence, speak, for your mouth has been opened. You who were despised, from henceforth be lifted up, for your righteousness has been lifted up. And the rest of it goes on like this, sort of talking about the downtrodden and the oppressed. And then later on they'll say, I fashioned their members in my own breasts, I prepared for them, that they might drink my holy milk and live by it. So there the idea is, of course, people who are downtrodden and oppressed drink from the breasts of God and are strengthened.
Yeah.
And this brings to mind, of course, those votive figurines that are put in, I presume, as Thanksgiving offerings in so many, in temples in the earlier period. Anyway, thoughts on all this?
Yeah, so in earlier periods in Judah and Israel, there's also a tradition of, they're called the Judean pillar figurines, the JPFs. And they are kind of cylindrical figurines that have very heavy breasts that they're holding. And so a good art, the author is Cynthia Chapman, but she has this whole idea that these also relate to similar sentiments, because in the Hebrew Bible, Jerusalem is often, the nation will nurse at the breasts of Jerusalem, or Jerusalem will drink the milk of kings. There's even aspects of the Bible where really old women nurse kind of like these kind of heroes of the tribes of Israel who are way too old to they're past those years, right? And they nurse, and it's kind of symbolic of this kind of protection and legitimacy of these leaders. And so, yeah, she argues that this idea is like breast milk is this kind of kinship-forming substance, and power, and gives power to them too, and that it's expressed in those figurines. It's around the same time as the goddesses, the nude figurines appear in Greece. These appear in Judah and Israel. Yeah.
You wrote the one from Beit Shean about
Yeah.
1000 BC or so in your.
Yeah, that's a pillar figurine, but yeah, not everyone agrees with that interpretation either, because once again, a lot of the pillar figurines are also found in households, so they're not sanctuaries to goddesses. So people have other ideas about what they could have meant in the context of a household, but it's certainly there seems to this tradition that you're reading centuries later in the Odes of Solomon seems to like derive from these earlier traditions. Like it seems to be something that's alive and well in Israel in Judah for a while. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
I know that you're researching why these figurines decrease in number over time, but have you noticed anything about the characteristics of the statues, if they change as they go farther in age?
They start off as handmade in the very earlier periods. So there's a few that date before 800, in Crete especially. They become more mass-produced by being made in molds in the 7th and 6th centuries. So it's kind of hard because once they're mass-produced, not in our modern sense, but in the sense that there's dozens of them being made in the same mold. So many of them, in Crete, have their hands only straight by their sides. But I don't know if that's because that's the molds that they're using and they're just producing more of them. So it skews your kind of counts in terms of just hand making them, or if they're more kind of a one-off, kind of expensive item, like that horse frontlet, right? You're not going to be making dozens of those, right? That's a one-off item that isn't a luxury item, really being dedicated, made of bronze, or certain ones that are carved out of ivory. It's hard to say. The ones the hands straight by the side are interesting though, because they seem to also be almost approximating this type of worship in the Greek and the Phoenician worlds, where you don't worship a cult statue, you worship like a pillar. And this shows up in Crete. There's evidence of worship of pillars. They're called aniconic worship, right? So I don't know if they're kind of approximating that too by being very stiff and straight and upright. In the Bible, they even have a word called Asherah, which seems to denote this kind of pillar that one worships. That might represent a goddess. This is the huge question. But there's images, just like we saw the nude female standing on lions. There's at least one example from Israel where you see the pillar on the lion. And is there some kind of connection between the aniconic worship of a divinity and that? So I don't know if that's why they're so stiff like this, right? I don't know if I see a relationship. I'm not quite sure yet. So yeah, you're welcome. Yes.
You mentioned that in Greece, many of these figurines are found in shrines or temples of goddesses. Is there any particular pattern of which goddess?
Yeah, it's a great question. Not really, which is why I don't think it's related to one goddess. We don't always know which goddesses are worshipped. That's sometimes a difficult question to answer. Lots of sanctuaries on Crete show this image. We're not always sure which goddesses those are. Maybe Athena is some of them. On Rhodes, it's usually Athena. This is Samos. This is the goddess Hera. Miletus, which was one of those examples that needs to be updated because they've been excavating a temple of Aphrodite there and are publishing the results, is Aphrodite. Sparta, which is here, is a mysterious goddess called Orthia, Orthia, which also means upright, right? Orthos, That is actually a goddess, and she's really there's a lot to go into there, a lot to unpack there. She later becomes called Artemis Orthia, so she's later Artemis. Ephesus is also Artemis, which is over here, the goddess Artemis. Trying to think what other if you have, and Olympia and Parachora, which is Corinth and Parachora, is Hera again. So I don't see really any patterns between. Once again, often the tendency is to see them as Aphrodite because she is the goddess of sex and love, but it's not. It shows up, and you might think, well, Athena's a virgin and goddess, as is Artemis. But once again, in some of their early manifestations, they might not be. And there's also traditions, at least Athena has this very weird tradition where she nourishes the king of Athens. She doesn't breastfeed him. It's a really strange one of these strange stories where the god Hephaestus lusts after her, chases her, ejaculates on her, and she wipes it off onto the ground, and this king springs up. This baby springs up from the ground. Who is the king though? And the Athenians love to say we're autochthonous. We are from the soil. We are from this very place. We've always been here. And so she protects him, right? So it's like it preserves her virginity, but it also makes her this kind of protectress of a king. So all of I see it all in some ways, these goddesses kind of having some role in nurturing and protecting heroes and kings. And that's why this imagery makes sense for them, but it's not them themselves. Yes?
You made a brain cell fire for me, but does this kind of imagery have anything to do with the big gold statue of Artemis at Ephesus?
Oh, the one with all the bump? No one's ever figured out what those are. They're just
Amber beads.
amber beads? Okay.
There's tons of amber beads from there. The original statue would have been this big with the amber beads.
Okay. Oh, that's
Sorry.
interesting.
Is
Yeah.
that anything interesting?
Everyone I've talked. I've heard so many different interpretations.
That's one of the standard ones that's out there.
Yeah. So or it could have been breasts, tons of breasts, but no. Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, and it's much later. I think it shows up in the late Hellenistic or Roman period.
You see them also. There's the Anatolian Zeus has a little breastplate with these same objects on them. It's probably,
Yeah, so I don't think so. I don't have a clear answer for that, but it's a very interesting statue. And amber's really interesting too. And one of my students is working on amber, so I'll have to tell her that. Yes?
I'm struck by the parallel between the Egyptian figurine of the naked figure holding a snake in one hand and the lotus in the other, and of course that very famous, iconic figurine from the Heroic Museum in Crete of the snake goddess holding up.
Oh, yeah.
Between what kind of, how would you read the relationship between those two figures?
Yeah, so the snake goddess has the breast bearer. That's how Minoans have the ceremonial breasts and is holding two snakes. And I think one other version has her like this with snakes up her arms. Yeah, there are a lot of interesting connections. I think this goes back to the idea about Bronze Age Greece having these same ideas. There's some, I don't know. I don't have a clear answer because those figurines are so problematic in terms of how they were reconstructed as well. But there is a really interesting tradition also of, at the end of the Bronze Age in Minoan Crete, of goddesses, of figurines and shrines of goddesses like this, right? Also kind of making that gesture. They're called goddesses with upraised arms. They're GUIs. They become popular in Crete as well, in shrines, along with nude female figurines. So I think there's some relationship, and I think in Greece, there is kind of a major goddess of the palace being worshipped as well at different sites, including at Knossos and in mainland Greece. That often goes by the word Potnia, which means mistress. But I don't know if that's who's being represented by those images. But yeah, people have asked about that, and also connections to the earlier Cycladic civilizations, which also dedicate these kind of marble figurines of like women like this, female bodies with they're called folded arms figurines. So here's all your jargon: FAFs, GUAs and FAFs and JPFs, the Judean pillar figurines. And people ask, is there a connection to those too? And they often show up in graves. And I don't know. I think probably in some way, but it's hard to kind of draw all the links together. Yeah. Yes.
I noticed in the circular mold series figurines, they're obviously limited kind of females here in the circular series, and how often they here.
Like these ones? Yeah, oh yeah, males, there's males here fighting, sorry, it's upside down. And there's a male god here too. I'd say this god is male on this side. Might be a god or a spirit. And many of these bronze bulls show like scenes of heroes. Actually, I'd say they're mostly male. They're mostly males out fighting and hunting.
You see around the edges of gold, you see male-female transition. Yeah, is it one matter?
No, sometimes it's all males. Like I said, hunting deer, hunting lions, being at war. Yeah, there's no kind of pattern or anything. This is pretty unique, this one too, with those kind of 4 shrines or something with these figures in them, including the nude female. It's pretty unique. Yeah, yeah.
Not to take away anything from any of the stuff that you said, because I think it's all really interesting. Have you thought about a simpler explanation for all those terracotta male female figurines, especially the ones dealing with their breasts and their vaginas? Mm-hmm. They're votive offerings to the goddess sanctuary for a good, safe childbirth.
Yes, this is
the single most dangerous thing for a woman to do, to have a kid.
Yeah. This is certainly one of the other interpretations that's been, and especially because in the Levant, they show up in houses mostly. That's mainly where they show up. And so it's like household rituals that one would do. So yes, certainly. And I think this is an imagery that goes back to the 3rd millennium BCE. It shows up in all media, across all different things from, it's on horse frontlets, it's on handmade figurines, it's on pendants. There's a couple of examples of monumental forms. Like it can't always have the same meaning, right?
They don't have the same, yeah, but some of those mass produced, obviously, common clay people are using it for something.
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. There's some in the Levant that are thought to even maybe be a bit pregnant. It's hard to say. But yeah, this goes back to the Bible too, because I think there's these ideas of like the breastfeeding, the birth, the breastfeeding, and the weaning. That is the successful bringing up of a child. That is what you want to do. It's all those steps. And then the person's fully human, right? And so you want to have that happen. But I think it's all. Yeah, and I think it's all tied together, right? The idea that they could be about breastfeeding and nourishing and bringing up a child safely, both the mother and child. But that idea of safety and protection could also be a king who also wants to be nourished and protected. Like I think it's translatable across these media. So I think certainly the meanings could change. And people have suggested in Crete that they were maturation rites that they would dedicate to. I don't know. That's another thing for the cycladic figurines is also that they were kind of transitional rites that people, as they went through puberty or as they became married and had children, people transiting to death, they would come to the grave, right? These are all life transitions people would go through. So, yeah, and I think it's not just about kings and elites. I think this imagery and these meanings translate to all levels of society, and they make sense to everyone, right, when they see that. So when a king says, "I nurse at the breast of the goddess," or something, it doesn't sound weird. It sounds like something people would understand. When Hector's mother, holds out her breast to him, that's not weird to them. Well, it sounds weird to us. Thank you. Oh, yes.
I was wondering if you thought that any of the statues from the Mediterranean region were maybe connected with statues like the Venus of Willamette from Lower Austria?
Yes, this once again goes back to the more kind of fertility mother goddess idea that they descend from these Neolithic figurines that are these very plump female bodies that are, once again, some of them are. I visited Malta this summer, which is they have huge stone sculptures of these plump goddesses, not just figurines. I'm talking like huge, monumental stuff from the Neolithic. And what the archaeologist taking us around said that this is what people would, this is his interpretation, this is what people would have wished for this because of the danger of childbirth. You wanted to be plump and big, right, and able to do that. I don't know if that's the truth, and we can't know. I mean, this is so far. So, yeah, and once again, there's connections between the early Bronze Age figurines and the Cyclades drawn to these Neolithic figurines. Like, there must be some kind of, like, development over time between these. Going the other way, the nursing female is often related to Mary nursing Jesus, right? The Mary the lactans figurine, which is thought to have been borrowed from pagan iconography of Isis nursing Horus or other Hera nursing Hercules. So there's probably links. Between them all to some extent, right? But over 3,000-4,000 years, these kind of meanings change and evolve too, and as do the figurines. So Yep.
Yeah, so you're talking about how it was common for this era to have these feminine figures covering their breasts or their genitalia. Was that also a trend in male statues where they would cover their genitalia, or that was just a female statues?
Yeah, males were usually warriors hunting warriors. They could be naked. They often had armor on. I'm trying to think of some examples. What's interesting is that when the Greeks start sculpting more monumentally out of limestone and later marble, it's the males that are naked and the females that are clothed. I mean, they do tend to kind of reverse that trend. The males they're doing anything with their body parts. So it's from what we can, the earliest ones are quite actually also stiff and frontal, and they're just kind of striding forward. They're called the kouros, the youth statue. So no, we don't have examples of that. Although a book has just come out on male nudity in the Iron Age by Sarah Murray. So I'll have to consult that when I get my hands on it to make sure. But as far as I know, no. Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious, do we see an increase in the value of the materials in the work put into these objects when they move from the domestic context into the temple sanctuary context?
Yeah, I would say, this is just off the top of my head, and I don't think we have any examples from households in Greece. We also don't have maybe a lot of households excavated in Greece from the Iron Age, so there's that issue. And in the Levant, the ones in the households tend to be quite modest. They're terracotta figurines. In Greek sanctuaries, they are all over the map. Some of them are like that bronze horse frontlet, which would be a big deal to have. They're ivory carved figurines or bone carved figurines of nude females, but they go all the way from ivory, bronze, silver, electrum, which is an alloy of gold and silver, all the way down to terracotta. And we did some more research, closer research on the trends on Crete. And by the later period, it's actually almost entirely mold-made terracotta. And actually the other more expensive materials are kind of a feature of the middle period, the kind of 7th century. By the 6th century, they're almost all terracotta mold-made figurines from Crete, at least. That's one we did a closer study of them. So it actually seems to go the other way, really. Yeah. I don't know why, but yeah, you're welcome.
So I guess we will call an end to the formal questions, but feel free to come up and ask Megan any questions you have and let everyone else run free.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Megan.
Thank you.